Welcome to the Show Up Dad podcast, where we explore the journey of fatherhood and provide valuable insights to help dads show up for their families. I'm your host, David Mendonca, and today we have a very special guest. But before we delve into our conversation, I want to express gratitude to our sponsors for their support. This episode of the Show Up Dad is sponsored by Tall Man Equipment, a trusted provider of high-quality tools and equipment for the power line industry. Visit tallmanequipment.com to explore their wide range of products and how they can assist you. I also want to give a special shout out to the Show Up Dad Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting fathers on their journey to show up for their families. Through workshops, resources, and a supportive community, the Show Up Dad Foundation empowers dads to be present and make a positive impact in their children's lives. Learn more about the mission and how you can get involved at theshowupdadfoundation.org. Well, guys, today we have a very special guest joining us. His name is none other than Brian Karr. He's the co-founder of We Inspect and the esteemed host of the highly regarded radio podcast Mold Finders. Together, they are aiming to raise awareness and provide valuable insights to assist individuals in identifying and eliminating the concealed mold that may be causing health issues. So, without further ado, welcome to our show, brother.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Brian, we had been following you for quite a while now. For those who are listening right now who don't know, my wife and my son suffer from a chronic illness. They both had Lyme disease. Well, Lyme disease has its own complications with mold. And we just wanted to invite you on here to just clarify some of the misconceptions that go behind people think about mold and how it affects them and stuff like that. I ran across a ton of people that always ask me all these different questions about it. And it's like, man, I'm just going to get you on here. You're the professional. So thank you.
No, absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity. Mold it's actually much more of a regarded health trigger now than it used to be. Mm-hmm. But even with that said, we're still in the very early stages of mass understanding of what it is, how it works, how it impacts you, the myths, the things that are true, the things that are not true. And so being able to have conversations like this, for me is rewarding because it helps to shift people's, perceptions of what maybe they thought to be true versus what is actually true and what we know is actually true via a whole bunch of research studies and the way that we work and everything. So it's really cool.
Yeah, heck yeah. Well, let's get started, Brian. Cool. Tell us your story. How did you get involved in all this, bro, if you don't mind?
Yeah, well, I didn't go to school to be a mold guy. That's for sure. Nobody who's really at the cutting edge of this industry started out to be in this industry. Whether you're on the health side of things or you're on my side of things or whatever it is, usually what happens is either you had an issue or a family member or something had some sort of issue that kind of forced you into seeing it. And then once you see it, certain people are just like, whoa, this is kind of my calling or what I need to be doing, or this is a shift in how I approach things or whatever. And, it's kind of what happened for me. I'm not a medical practitioner. I talk to a lot of them. I know a good amount about it, but, maybe enough to be dangerous, but not to actually, heal anyone myself. But I saw it differently. I saw it through a situation in my own place. So I'll try to go through it quickly, but basically I was living in an apartment in West Hollywood. All the buildings there are old. They're like these 40s, 30s, older buildings, right? And the majority of it's all owned by landlords, like larger companies, property management companies, things like that. So their goal is not necessarily a healthy home for people. Their goal is, how much money can I get per door on this multifamily unit that I'm buying that's going to be part of my investment portfolio, right? And so when you understand how someone's looking at something, then you understand what their motivations are behind it, right? And so you know that their goal is not to make you the healthiest. Their goal is to kind of pacify you as much as they can so you don't cause any problems and cost them extra money, right? And that's sort of the problem, with this, even now we're moving so much more into large groups owning property and more people renting than owning before. It's another conversation. But anyways, I was in this place and long story short, a pipe burst above my bed and flooded into my room. It was a big water loss. I called the landlord right away. Hey, got this thing, whatever. So they come and they send their handyman guy or whatever, and he comes, he stops the water leak, right? And then they dry out the ceiling, right? They're like, okay, let's dry the ceiling. They fix the pipe and they're like, okay, you're all good, right? Let alone there's still water staining all over my ceiling and all this stuff. They're like, but everything's good, everything's fine. Like, okay. And so, I go about staying in this place. This was in 2008. I had just been laid off from my job because it was the recession time when all of that happened, so I was at home like way more often. So kind of think like what happened to everyone during COVID, except it happened to like me specifically in 2008, but it was the same thing. It's like you used to be out of your house all the time and now you're in your house all the time. Right. And that's what happened to me. And so I was breathing the stuff in all the time and I was getting progressively more symptomatic. Like brain fog. A lot of people talk about brain fog. So I had a brain fog issue that I started feeling. And then I started getting skin problems. I started getting eczema breakouts on my face. And those were like my two big things from a symptom perspective that happened to me. And so it's kind of progressing and I'm dating who's now my wife at the time. And her dad, who ended up being my mentor, who I ended up kind of like introduced me to all this. But anyways, her dad did this and he's like one of the most highly respected people in the country that does this. And he specifically works with people who are sick and impacted and understands all this stuff. And so I'm talking to my girlfriend about it and she's like, hey, what you're saying about how you're feeling and stuff, this sounds a lot like what my dad kind of talks about his clients. And like, you just had this water leak thing. Like you might have a mold problem, right? Is basically what she tells me. And so I'm like, oh, interesting. I hadn't met her dad yet. I didn't want this to be the way that I met her dad. So I called the landlord like a normal person would probably do. And I say, hey, you know what? I'm not feeling right, thinking that, they care about me. I'm not feeling right. I think there might be a mold issue. And immediately it's like, oh, there can't be mold. It's dry. We do this all the time. We own all these buildings. There's no way that's a problem. But I push a little bit. They're like, fine, we'll send somebody out. We'll send a mold inspector out, right? And basically what happens, they send some guy out who takes an air sample in my room for 5 minutes and he leaves. He's in my apartment for no longer than 15 minutes. That result comes back 24 hours later, says everything's fine, comes back and tells me, you're fine. There's nothing wrong here. Whatever's wrong with you has nothing to do with us. So then I end up reaching out to her dad and he comes. He spends 2 hours in my 800 square foot apartment. He finds 8 different problems throughout my whole apartment over the course of that time. And not just my room, but to focus on my room with what happened. So if you're like visualizing this, those of you listening, so like imagine you have like your kitchen counter, like your island, right? And let's say you have like a gallon of water and you just pour the water on the island. It's going to go sideways, right? Because you're going to pour, it's going to spread sideways. And it's going to get to the end of the island and it's going to fall down and then it starts dripping down the side of your island, right? So that's that's just how it works, right? It's gravity, it's science, is how it works.
Yeah.
Well, in my ceiling is a flat horizontal surface, the same as a countertop. And so what happened is all this water hit and it went sideways. And then after it went sideways and it got to the end of the ceiling, it found where the walls connected and went straight down the walls. And so ultimately what happened when he came in, all my walls were still wet. They were actually wet at that time, months later. They were damp, right? There was no water staining on them. There was nothing visible like that, right? And lo and behold, I'm sleeping ultimately in a toxic box for months. And that's why I was continuously kind of like degrading. Yeah. And so he helps me figure it out. He helps me navigate how to talk to the landlord and get out of my lease and all these things, which I won't go. I could do a whole thing on that. And then afterwards, I was still like looking for a job, right? And I saw this and I saw the first guy come in who was there for 10 minutes or whatever. And then I saw what my father-in-law did. And I was like, for whatever reason, I was just like drawn out. Like, I need to be doing this. Is what I need to be doing. And I, on the spot, as soon as he like kind of finished me wrap it up, I asked if I could come work with him. And that's how it started. And then I was training with him, and just that was the beginning of the process.
Man, thank you so much for sharing your story, brother. Just when you're talking about it, man, I was going through all the same things that we dealt with our landlord and mold inspections and everything. You're absolutely right. They will do the bare minimum. It's crazy. And I'm glad you're on here, like I said, because there is so much that people need to hear about this. We could go on for hours and hours. But the first question I want to ask you, how are you doing today?
Oh, I'm way better. So there's kind of like, I've seen like 2 types of people. You have your people that have more chronic issues, long-term issues, and then you have people that have more like acute exposure problems, right? So like genetically, I'm not genetically predisposed to not be able to detox properly. There's 25% of the population that literally just has a genetic expression. That means if you are impacted by mold or toxins, sorry, you can't detox it. So it just
Mhm.
builds up, and it creates like chronic conditions, right? So it's literally 25% of like humanity is that person, right?
Wow.
Luckily, I'm not one of those people, right? And so, my exposure was short. There were, I think where I'm at now has nothing to do with that first exposure, but then I started doing this for a living, and I was a decade in the worst homes that exist. And even when you're doing proper protection and you're doing all the things you're supposed to, there's still exposure that happens at that point if you're constantly just doing it and doing it. And at the beginning, I wasn't protecting myself properly because you just don't get it, right? You just don't understand. And my exposure was a lot more at the beginning. So, I mean, I currently right now have mycotoxins in my body that I'm still working to get out. But overall, from a health perspective, like I'm in good shape. I'm good. I'm not like, I don't have any sort of chronic things like that. And now I'm just
Mhm.
sort of trying to optimize, like understanding how these things impact, your body and stuff. As like, I want to get this stuff out of here, right? So I'm kind of working through it. But ultimately, I work with people that are a million times worse than that. And that's really the thing that I think really got me into this was, I trained and I learned from Mark for a while. And then when I went out on my own for the first time, like solo, after I had gone through this, the very first client that I had, his name was Nick. Um, he did have that genetic predisposition, and he was so bad that he actually developed like additional conditions on top of it. So he developed multiple chemical sensitivity. So a lot of times what will happen is that people, the mold piece is sort of like the foundation
Mhm.
of throwing your immune system off. And then other things lay on top of it. Other conditions start laying on top of it. And it becomes really difficult to understand why you might have chemical sensitivity or mast cell activation syndrome or like these other things without getting to the root of it, which is kind of mold ruined your foundation, if you will. And so now your whole house is collapsing, right? And so then it's like,
Mhm.
you got to get to that piece. So with him, it had been developing, and he was wearing a mask. I mean, this is early 2010s or whatever this was. Like,
Mhm.
now people do it and you're like, COVID happened, whatever. But like this guy, he couldn't be anywhere outside of his own apartment without a mask on because the chemicals were so sensitive to him that were just happening everywhere. So I went through a place with him and basically found a lot of things that he wasn't aware of on a place he was going to purchase. And at the end of that whole process, he told me that I saved his life. And that was the thing that was like the, call it the drug or the dopamine hit or the whatever, where it's like, oh my God, I made like a real difference in somebody's life from doing this thing. And
Mhm.
that was the thing that kind of like got me hooked.
Wow. Wow. Man, what a tremendous story. My mother-in-law, Brian, she suffers with that allergic reaction to smells, chemicals, and stuff like that for the longest time. Everybody's like, "Oh, you're crazy." You know what I mean? There's
Yeah.
nothing. And now what we know today, she wasn't crazy. It was mast cell activation. It was years and years of exposure in homes that, deemed they shouldn't have even been livable, right?
Yeah.
Because of the mold and stuff like that was growing. It just goes to show you where we've come over time. Just even in the 80s and 90s, everybody's like, what's black mold? That don't grow, and it's like, no, it does grow. And that's what I wanted to ask you next is how common is it in mold growth in homes, and what are the main factors that contribute to its growth for the people that don't know?
Yeah, it's super common, right? It's actually more rare. I mean, I could probably count on literally two hands the number of times I've walked into a place and didn't find anything in a house, right? And so when I say that, the immediate reaction from someone is like, oh, well, it's everywhere. So like, it just is what it is. Like, what are you supposed to do, right? And it's almost like this defense, like to that statement, right?
Yeah.
But I always want to I want to start there because just because something happens all the time doesn't mean that it should be happening all the time, right? I think we
Yeah.
could think in life of things that happen where we're like, you know what, it'd be really cool if this didn't happen, right? But unfortunately, we've gotten to this point and this happens now, right? But like
Yeah.
eventually you start to desensitize from it and it just becomes normal and you just sort of deal with it, right?
Hmm.
And that's what mold is for a lot of people, right? Because they come and they say mold grows everywhere. It's normal. It's now you're not going to find, and so then they rationalize it and say, okay, well, then it's not a problem. That's not what's causing me, because if it's everywhere, but I'm the only one that's not feeling good and somebody else is feeling fine, then it can't be that, right? And you start kind of creating these associations that actually don't make any sense in science. But
Hmm.
the people who are doing this, they don't know the science, right? They're just
Yeah.
doing like correlation from what they're seeing. And so you start creating like these false stories and these false beliefs around what's actually happening. And it becomes detrimental to a lot of people's health. And it's not on purpose. It just kind of is what we do as people, right? As humans, it's what we do. But different people are going to react differently, right? Like if you're one of those 25% of people, you're going to be way more sensitive. If you're someone who has Lyme or you have autoimmune conditions or you have other things, your immune system's already depleted. And so now you add on an additional stressor to that and it sends your body into overdrive. I like to think of this analogy, which helps, kind of like visualize how this works. Imagine your immune system is a funnel. And so, a funnel, it's like big on the top, tight on the bottom, right? And you like pour oil in it or whatever, and it goes in the car, right? So imagine that's your immune system. So it's wide on the top. That's everything you're exposed to. It's not just mold, it's literally everything. It's the chemicals that you use to clean your house. It's the cars driving by and the smoke from them. It's the EMF that you're exposed. It's all that stuff, right? That's everything your body's exposed to. As the funnel slants down, that is your body dealing with it, detoxing it, protecting itself from it, trying to get rid of it. That's what your body's doing. And then out at the bottom, less comes out. And that's like kind of the time it takes for your body to get it out. And so if you think of a funnel, if you've ever poured water in a funnel, if you pour it in too fast, it overflows. If you regulate how fast you pour it into the funnel, you can do a continuous pour into your funnel for gallons of water as long as you're pouring it in slowly enough and allowing the funnel to let it run out and come out the bottom. So this is what our immune system is like. Everyone's immune system needs time to process what's going on. And everyone's immune system is different. So some people's funnel is a really narrow, tight hole at the bottom. Other people's funnel is a much bigger hole at the bottom. If it's a tight hole, that means you can't be exposed to as much. You have to pour slower in the top. If it's a big wide hole at the bottom, you could straight up pour a gallon of water straight through it and it just flies through the bottom, right? Those are two different people that could be living in the same house, exposed to the same stuff, but because their immune system is different and what they've been exposed to is different and how their body reacts is different, one person could be having a problem where somebody isn't. And so when you understand how we react and the differences in just kind of humans and how our bodies are kind of working at that point in time, then you start to understand that just because mold is everywhere doesn't mean that it's okay. It means for someone whose funnel is tighter at the bottom, you need to reduce that exposure more so their body doesn't get overflowed and the funnel overflows from the top because they're being exposed from too much, right? And so now it's a formula. It's how do I detox as opposed to how much am I exposed to? And you have to balance it. And if you could balance it, then your body kind of hits this homeostasis and it's kind of working, right? And so the thing is that you don't ever, you would never expect or feel like a zero mold exposure situation is what you need. It's not even possible, right? And that's why I say mold is in every place. But if you can reduce the amount that's in places and protect the home that you're in your environment then if you're somebody who's more impacted, you can find that balance and you can be okay. And that shows you that just because mold is a frequent thing doesn't mean it's okay. It impacts us. It just impacts us all differently.
Yeah, no, for sure. One of the things I took off of your website that I saw that I thought was just remarkable, and it was something so basic that everybody could do, is if you're living in a moldy environment, right, to limit the exposure, you could open up the windows and get that fresh air in there, right? And I think, correct me if I say this wrong, you quoted that in order to fix polluted air, you have to dilute the air with clean air coming in, correct?
Yeah, so now I can't take credit for the quote. So the quote actually came from my friend, Dr. Jill Christa, who took it from her mentor, Dr. Walter Crinney. And I've lined this quote all the way back. But the quote is, the solution to pollution is dilution. So if you're diluting the air and you're reducing the amount of pollution in the air, then there's not as much there, right? So that's the thought process around that. So that's one thing that you can do while you're in a space that might have problems that can help sort of continuously dilute. But if you have issues in your house, it's almost like you're filling up like a water bottle again. It's like, okay, we poured it out, we diluted it, and now we're filling it up again, more, right? And so it's, sometimes a short-term short-term relief when you're doing that. Air purifiers, removal of dust in the home, which harbors this stuff. Like, there are some things that you can do to reduce your exposure, but at the end of the day, you can't keep up if there's a lot of sources, right? That's just like kind of a piece of the plan.
So going back to mold, Brian, say they do that dust test, because you said earlier how they did a air quality
Mm-hmm.
test, right? And from what I know now, that doesn't prove anything. You can literally have a air purifier in the middle, or not purifier, an air tester in the middle of a room, and it'll pick up zero, right?
Yep.
Now, with that being said, I know the dust method, right?
Yep.
That's a better way to test for it. What are the so if say for instance you have dust, you get the swab, it gets tested, it comes back as positive mold, right?
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean that there's mold growing in your home, or does that mean that that blew in through your windows, or how does that work?
It's a good question. So there's a lot there.
Yeah.
So first on the air sample piece, because I think it's really important to kind of to reinforce what you were saying. Most local inspectors, wherever you are, what they're going to do is come and bring in an air sample pump and stick it in the middle of your room, and they're going to say they're doing an air quality test.
Mhm.
And the rationale makes sense initially. You breathe the air. We're going to test the air and see if there's anything in the air that you're breathing, right? So like it kind of lines up, right? It makes sense when you think of it that
Yeah.
way. The problem with that is an air sample, volatile, I'll say, in terms of what it will show you, right? So if I put my 5-year-old in that room and had her jump around and playing, as opposed to I was just in that room and sitting there, or I just had windows open in that room or whatever else, you can get very wildly different readings in a very short amount of times. It doesn't have to be that specific of a disturbance. If your air conditioning turned on, you're now pulling air that you weren't pulling in your house before, which could
Yeah.
then move air in that space and maybe change what's going on. So it's a very variable test that can be altered very easily, right? And so if we're doing any type of testing, you don't want a test that's so specific that if I breathe differently, all of a sudden my blood test is going to show something different, right? You don't want that type of relationship between the test that you're doing and how accurate it is. And the accuracy of that test is just all over the place, right?
Yeah.
And so the things with air samples is they are actually really, really good for certain things, but they're really poor for other things. This type of way that we're talking about it, it's just not the right test to achieve that goal, right? The
Yeah.
goal of a test in the middle of a room is actually not to tell you where the mold's coming from, right? That's if you were doing that, why would you test in the middle of the room? So the reason you're testing in the middle of the room, and the reason a lot of these local companies, they'll say air quality test, the goal then that they're implying is just to understand if there's mold in your space. Like that's got to be what the goal is at that point, right? And
Yeah.
so if that is your goal, it's the wrong test. That's where dust testing comes into play, because the variability of air samples with whatever's floating around during the time and all that stuff, that all goes away when I'm able to just wipe, like literally with like a Swiffer cloth, basically wipe dust that has collected on surfaces, because gravity brings all of that down to the surface. So no longer are you chasing it in the air and hoping it's happening to be floating around when you're taking the test. You're going to the source of where all of it is, and you're just wiping it up and you're seeing what's going on. So if the purpose is just, do I have a mold problem or do I not have a mold problem? Air samples in the middle of the room are the not wrong test to be using. We did an internal study on this for a year. I would go into a place and, like, let's say I thought there was mold in a wall, right? Well, I would
Yeah.
test the wall the way you're supposed to test at where you think the source of the problem is. But then I'd also step literally, like, I don't know, 2-3 feet away, and I put an air sample pump at like breathing level, and I would test there too. 78% of the time when there was a problem in the wall, the air sample that was 3 feet away said there was no mold problem.
Wow.
Yet this is what every local inspector is doing. So now they're coming in and you basically have a 78% fail rate if there is a problem within a few feet, right? And so like
Yeah.
what's the good of that, right? And so the dust testing, it takes that variability out. And what it's doing is you're analyzing and you're through DNA sequencing of mold types that are in the dust. And yes, there's normal, mold that comes in from the outside and that sort of thing. But the cool thing about the dust test is that it takes your results from that sample, and then we actually overlaid our in-person inspections that we had done over a 3-year period on top of that to show correlations and to show a kind of rankings of how your home compared to all the homes that we looked at. So to give you context, like if you swiped, and you wiped a Swiffer cloth and you come back and on the dust test, we have different codes. So code 1 to code 5. Code 1 is the lowest load of mold. Code 5 is the highest load of mold. And then you have, ranges in the middle, right?
Yeah.
So if you come back and you're like a code 4, you're like, all right, there's a problem here. There's definitely multiple sources of mold here because it's overlaying real homes that we inspected. And then we created relationships between the dust testing data to understand what someone could really expect, like the potential impact in their home, right? And so that's really why dust testing is so much better. You get rid of the variability of whatever's floating around. You get a much deeper analysis down to the DNA level. And then if you're somebody who's sick, and you're really kind of going down this road, you'll start hearing words like mycotoxins and toxic mold and that sort of thing. And it's the species of the mold that lets you understand toxic capabilities. So there's a mold that's known as like aspergillus. It's a pretty common mold. Well, there's a bunch of species of aspergillus, and some of them produce toxins and some of them don't. So if you did a body mycotoxin test, which is done through a urine test, there's a lot of labs that do it, and you find, for example, that you have otratoxin A, which is a mycotoxin, and then you go and you do the dust test, you could actually see the species of molds that correlate to ochratoxin A. And now you can start understanding, oh, I am being exposed to this in my house, right? And you can start putting that together. So that's the benefit of going through dust testing to answer the question of, do I have a problem and how bad is the problem? Because you have that scale of 1 to 5. After that, what you then need to do is you have to figure out where the problem's coming from. So it doesn't do you any good to say, my house has a mold problem, right? Okay, well, what do I do, right? So now the next step is to decide, am I going to investigate my home further or not? Some people don't want to, right? Some people do. And if you are, then that's where an inspection comes into play. Is it in this wall? Is it in this ceiling? Is it underneath this cabinet? Like, where is it? And once we know where the different sources are, those are each individual factories that are contributing to everything you found in that dust test. So now you're finding the contributors to what you picked up in that dust sample. And now you can understand which ones are the worst. You can prioritize them. You can be really strategic about how you remediate. Again, going back to what we said at the top, you don't have to remove every single bit of mold in your house. You just want to remove a chunk of it, a good chunk of it. And again, depending on your health is how much of a chunk you need to remove, right? But you want to remove the things that are the worst. And you want to start there and work your way down. And that's how we're able to help people kind of prioritize how they approach remediation and get the most kind of impact for their remediation.
No, that's some great information, Brian, for sure. I wanted to ask you, just out of curiosity, how common is it for it to be in the carpet?
So it's a very specific question. So there's a couple ways that it gets in the carpet, right? One is we talked about how gravity brings things down to the surface, right?
Yeah.
So let's say I have a mold problem in a few walls, and maybe my HVAC has a mold problem, let's just say, and it's spreading mold throughout the house. Well, your carpet's going to retain all of that dirt and dust, right? You can't clean it like you do a hard floor, right? Like it all gets in there. And then what happens is that there's this concept called the human cloud effect. And so basically what it means is as you walk around, you create disturbances every time you sit on something, every time your foot walks on something, every time you bump something. And ultimately, as you move through your house, you're creating this invisible cloud of disruption around you, of invisible particles. Think of the dirty kid in Charlie Brown, Pigpen.
Pigpen. Yeah.
So that kid walked around with a cloud of dirt around him all the time. We do the same exact thing, except it's not smelly, gross dirt. It's invisible particles that are constantly surrounding us. So the reason dust is important and what's happening there and why it's such a good indicator of what's going on in a home is because that's also what we're being exposed to, because we're constantly popping that up into our space. So if we find that there's, mold issues in a house, part of the cleaning plan is you got to get rid of your carpet. Because why am I going to rip out 2 or 3 walls and like go through this process of remediating? All of it has built up and retained in the carpet, and then I go walk around my house and it still pops up in my face and I'm still breathing it. So there's parts that we have to build into the plan, and there's phases of it, right? And so it's why you understand sort of the construction of the house, what's in the house, where the problems are, and you start putting together the roadmap for somebody.
So once you've gone through all this stuff, you have all these different stages that you got to go through, right? You found mold and everything, or you haven't found mold, right? Ultimately, what is some wisdom you can give to us for those out there who don't have a mold problem now, but they want to prevent getting mold? We moved from New Mexico to Southern California, and my gosh, mold grows so much more faster than in that dry climate than it is here, right? So
Yeah.
what are some tips you can give the listeners, brother, if you don't mind?
Yeah. So mold needs water to grow. It does not need water to stay. This might be the biggest problem in our entire industry is that statement.
Okay.
What happened in my apartment? It's dry now. There's no more mold. Well, no. It grew when the water was there, and then you dried it, and now it's still there, except now it's dry and it's flaking off and getting into my room a lot easier, right? So it does need water to grow, though. So if we're talking about prevention, then the first thing you think in your mind is, where do I have water in the house? Most frequently, right?
Yeah.
And this is another one of those things that we see it so often that we just like, oh, my kids splash out of the tub. It's kids, it's the tub, whatever. And it's normal. So we have to stop it happens all the time, so it's okay mindset. And instead we need to shift it. It happens all the time. I need to be more aware of this so I can handle it mindset, right? So like not normalizing something, but actually using it as an awareness trigger for us, right? So as you're thinking through, like, what do? You start thinking of where your primary water sources are, and those are the first things that you start thinking about. So the pretty big ones are sinks, right? There's sinks everywhere. All the sinks have plumbing underneath. If you dropped me down anywhere in the country and said my life depended on finding mold in the house that you just threw me in front of that I've never seen before, and I could only look in one type of room in the house, I would be in a bathroom and I'd be opening every sink cabinet. That would be it. If my life depended on it, that's where I'd go. And I'd probably live 80% of the time. Like that's how the odds would work for me. So like under sinks, because you get drips that happen under there, you get product bottles that leak. The primary ingredient in product bottles is water. And then they have little additives to do whatever it's supposed to do. But if your product bottle is leaking, that's water, right? You have a lot of stuff. You have plumbing in the back wall. You have plumbing that's hanging under the little kind of curved piece under there, right? You have all these, you have the faucet handles up there that sometimes leak. Like there's so many places just under a sink where water can drip from and get in there. And it happens way more often than you think. And what I would say is for people listening, it doesn't have to look like mold. In fact, most times where we find mold, there is no visible mold at all. What we're seeing is a little indicator of some sort of water damage, right? Drip stains, a little bubble in the paint, a little warp in a floor. There's no visible mold there, but the mold's under it. It's hiding under it. So the water watered it and it grew in the building material or behind the building material. So that's the big clue and indicator that you're looking for, right? So the first thing on prevention, sink cabinets, get one of those inserts that goes under your sink. I have one in every single sink in my house. It's like a little rubber insert. It can literally hold up to a gallon of water if for every reason there's a leak without it touching any of my cabinetry anywhere, right? So you get one of those and then you put a water sensor under there. And if for some reason there's a leak, it gives you time to get there before the damage is done and you can stop the problem, right? So that's a quick, easy thing. And that's where a whole lot of problems typically happen with water sources. Other areas are toilet areas, shower areas, again, areas where water is, your washing machine for your clothes, your dishwasher for your dishes, like all that stuff. And so you want to be hyper aware with your eyes around those places consistently. When I walk into a bathroom, granted, I've been doing this a long time, but like my eyes are always looking at this, even in my own bathrooms, they're always looking at the baseboards around my toilet to see if there's water staining or bubbling paint on them, at the walls and the baseboards by my shower. Like they're always looking. And if something is different, it's okay, what's happening? What's going on here? I got to figure this out, right? Like, is water getting out? Is it wet now? Like, what's happening? And so prevention is all about trying to stop the water from getting to things before it gets there. You want to be proactive on that front. And so those are the types of things that you could be doing to kind of get ahead of it. So like the protective inserts, water sensors, I have one under my water heater drip line. So if for whatever reason there's a drip out of my water heater in my garage, I'm going to know right away. It actually pinged on me a couple of weeks ago. And it had nothing to do with my water heater leak. Our cleaners actually like sprayed something over there for cleaning and it wet it, and bam, it hit me. And I was like freaking out. It's like, oh my God, my water heater's leaking. I went down there, it was fine. Right. But like,
Yeah.
what if it wasn't? Right. Then
Yeah.
I would have
Yeah.
been right on top of it. So there's a lot there. The other piece is on humidity real quick. So it's away from water sources, but humidity is something that we shouldn't be overlooking. I know a lot of people, especially in like climates, where Florida, the South, like all these places specifically, Tennessee, like that side over there, is very high humidity. And so a lot of people will end up having problems in their heating and air conditioning system because of where they are. And a lot of times the reason that they have it is because there's kind of two main things that I see happen. One, their air conditioning system has what's called a fresh air intake attached to it. What a fresh air intake means is that in theory, you're pulling air from outside to go into your air conditioning unit before it gets cooled, as opposed to recirculating air from the inside back into the system. So the theory is the air outside is cleaner than the air inside. So we want to pull outside air into the house. The problem is the air outside is like 75, 80% humidity, and you're pulling humidity in your HVAC system. You're basically watering your HVAC system and then expecting it not to grow mold everywhere. And so if you're in the South or you're anywhere that has humidity as any sort of concern, you absolutely never, ever want a fresh air intake on your air conditioning system. The other thing that will happen is if you open your windows a lot, you're now increasing humidity in your home. And so now you're pulling that into your system. You're going to start getting condensation on your windows, which is going to create water. That's going to create mold around your window frames. So managing the internal humidity in the house is really, really important. I want it to be 50% or less for me. Mold can start growing at 60. So if you aim for 50 and it elevates a little bit, because maybe you're on top of it or whatever, it's fine. You're not going to get into a bad space. So I always kind of like target 50. And if it gets to 55, you're not like in bad shape or anything.
Wow, man, that's some great information about the humidity. I know I'm always constantly on my daughter. She's 17 years old, and she likes to take extremely hot showers, right? With the window not open, with the fan not on or anything. And I open it, it's like, what the heck's going on in here? It's like a sauna, and oh man, it just drives me crazy. But we're working on that. But that's another big one too, right?
It is. Yeah, it is. My daughter's 5. So like I have time to like berate this into her, but like she knows, like if she's in the bath and she's playing in the bath, it's not even a joke. One drop of water comes out, the bath's over. She knows it. It's over.
Yeah.
She's like, I didn't mean to. I'm like, I get it, but be more careful next time. Bath's over. And maybe it makes me sound like, whatever, but it's so important. It's like,
it's training.
Yeah. So like my youngest is about to turn 3 in a couple weeks. So we're cementing it in with him now. He's still like, so if he does splash out, I'm drying it immediately. I'm getting it handled. I actually have a towel next to me during their bath time. I have a towel that's like up on the side of the tub. Like I am the water Nazi when it comes to bath time with the kids.
No, but I mean, it's crazy. It's amazing how fast it grows. I would not be a believer unless I've seen it myself, and like I said, we came from a dry climate to out here, and my gosh, mold grows so fast. One of the things that I saw with mold is the smell, right? It smells like wet t-shirts.
Yeah.
Kind of. It has this weird, distinct smell. And that's something that we started noticing even in the house we live in today. It's like this weird smell that it's almost like a wet dirt, kind of.
Yeah, it's like musty. That's how a lot of people describe it. I'd love to just comment on that real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
So sometimes people rely on that as their trigger to say, oh, I have a mold problem or I don't have a mold problem. Most places don't have that smell that have mold problems. And so I like, while that is an indicator, what that actually means, the smell that you're smelling is off-gassing from the mold actively eating and feeding and growing. Wow. In order for the mold to be active and growing, it needs to have active moisture at the time. So mold is less of a like alive and dead thing, and it's more of like an active, inactive thing. right? So like as soon as you put water back there, it's going to come back and start doing its thing and working. When you take it away, it stops. It's almost like the workers go home for the day, right? And then you bring the water back. It's like, oh, the workers are back at the factory doing their thing, right? And so think of that smell as like the smoke coming out of the top of the factory. Like that is the byproduct of them eating and doing their thing. And so that's what the smell is. So if someone has an odor in their house, it's not just there's a mold issue here from a previous leak that, yes, can still be causing problems. And to be frank with everyone, the majority of problems we find in a house are that. It's a previous water issue that has dried, but the mold colony and the spores and the fragments, they still get into the space and you still breathe them. That is the majority of what we find. But on the other side, if you're smelling something, that means it's actively growing right then. That means you have an active problem, which means there's a moisture problem that has not been addressed on top of the fact that there's a mold issue going on. So that's what that means.
Wow. Yeah, we definitely we need to get that checked. We usually get it like in our sink, from our sink. We've had different inspectors come in and plumbers and everything, and they put the little camera inside all the pipes, and there's no breaks or nothing like that, but we'll get that addressed. But one of the things that I thought was interesting, Brian, is you could be living in the same household, right? You could be exposed. It could not be affecting you severely or anything like that, but your spouse, she could be completely, or even your children can be completely affected and just devastated with this. One of the main things I wanted people to understand, just because that's happening doesn't mean your spouse is crazy or anything like that, right?
The majority of people that are impacted are women and kids. From a toxic mold perspective, from mycotoxins, they're fat soluble. Women have more fat than men do. Just physiologically, they have more fat. It makes them more susceptible for mycotoxins to soak into their fat tissue. So a lot of times they will be reactive before the man in the house is, just because of that. Kids will show because their immune systems aren't fully developed. A kid's immune system isn't fully developed until they're like somewhere between 18 and 20. So all that time leading up, like they're going to be more sensitive and more reactive as opposed to an adult who maybe wasn't exposed to stuff when they were a kid. Like I'm lucky. I grew up in Vegas, right? So Vegas is dry. It doesn't mean that there's not mold problems. Like my aunt's house is a disaster. She won't listen to me, right? Like there's just things that go on. But you don't have as much of the humidity problems that like compound it, right? So I didn't grow up in a significantly moldy area or anything like that, right? My exposure was pretty low looking back on it, on what may have been going on. And so when you think about like why someone would react differently to someone else, it's their genetic makeup, right? So we talked about the genetic piece. It's their previous exposures. So if you've been exposed to something, this happens a lot. People are like, oh, as a kid, I lived in the Midwest. I lived in the basement. It smelled like a sock. And, now looking back, I know that my room was basically in the basement with mold in it for a long time. Right. And so that happened as they were a kid growing up. It completely rewires their body at that point. Right. Because your immune system isn't developed. Your body starts learning what's going on. It starts being hyperactive all the time. Like it completely just changes how your body reacts. So if you were exposed to something previously, it can actually just change how your body now responds in the future as an adult, where maybe you experience that, but I didn't, right? So we could be in the same house and maybe you will react where I won't because that didn't happen to me and maybe it happened to you, right?
Yeah.
And then the third thing is your current health position. We talked about this earlier with like Lyme or autoimmune or something. If your immune system is currently being taxed and then you add a toxin or just even a mold exposure without toxin on top of it, it's starting with your immune system already be down a little bit. So now that person is not gonna be able to handle as much as somebody else is, right? So you mentioned your wife had Lyme. If you don't have Lyme yourself and she's reacting, well, it makes sense. She has something else that's like taxing her, right? So it makes sense that she would react and maybe you wouldn't right away. And those are kind of like the three big reasons that you might have somebody in a house reacting and not. I would say the majority of the people that we work with, not everybody in the house is reacting. Or if they are, the severity of the reaction is very different. A lot of times the man in the house is saying, no, I'm fine. And then the woman, the wife, she's like, well, actually, he's been having X, Y, and Z, but it all seems minimal, right? To him, he's like, whatever. And then she's really having a rough time, or their kid is really having a rough time. So you can see it manifesting in the different people in the house differently too. So like for you as the man, maybe your sleep is just getting kind of impacted a little bit. You're not sleeping as well. But for your wife, it's more of a chronic, sort of situation that's going on. Or for a kid, it's more of a neurological issue like PANS or PANDAS that's creating like behavioral changes and different things like that. And that could be the symptom cluster across every individual in the house. That varies widely. Right. But the core thing that's triggering those is the same. And it's just reacting differently in different people.
And you're absolutely right. That's what I've noticed too, Brian, is, I got a son who has severe eczema, right? Just showed up out of nowhere. I have another son who has gastrointestinal issues, bloating. I deal with headaches. I had the brain fog. I contributed that to COVID when I got COVID for like the 5th time. You know what I mean? But I had the brain fog, headaches, the sleeplessness, right? And what's crazy is like it goes away and then it comes back, or, you're constantly aware and you're constantly thinking, okay, is this mold? Even like today, prime example, my son was complaining that his head hurt. And right away I can see the wheels moving in my wife, because that's the way God created our wives to have a heart towards our children. And she automatically just, okay, son, did you hit your head? Did you do this? But deep down inside, because I know my wife so well, I know that's in the back of her head. Is this mold? Is he having an issue because of the mold or whatever? You know what I mean? Yeah. So it psychologically just really affects you, the whole family, really.
It does. And the thing that's really tough about it, and maybe this will help some people pinpoint it, is that there's not like one symptom that's like, oh, this is the mold illness. You have this, you have it. Like, it actually is the complete opposite of that. And so when you're talking to your traditional, MD doctors, your traditional medical doctors that you'll find through, your basic insurance and stuff and that, like they don't understand this stuff. And they'll tell you that it's not a big deal. And this is where you start getting we ran your blood. Your blood looks fine. Like there's nothing wrong with you. Oh, you should go see the psychiatrist. Apparently there's something going on, right? Yeah. When you start getting into the functional medicine world, it's a much different approach to how they're trying to understand what's happening in your body. And that's where people actually start getting progress on the health side. So if you're someone who hasn't even gotten to a functional doctor, you've never even heard of that or whatever that is, then like something that you can do is think about what the symptoms are that you're dealing with, whoever in your family is dealing with. If it's multi-symptom, then that is a big red flag that there's an environmental trigger. So what that means, so your systems in your body, neurological system, nervous system, digestive system, reproductive system, endocrine, which is your hormones, like these are all the different systems in your body, right? Yeah. And then on the symptom front, just pick one of those and you can have a lot of different symptoms that tie within that system, right? So neurological could be brain fog, for example, right? Could be headaches, could be those sort of things. Nervous system could be your sleep is being impacted. You're always in fight or flight. Like you have your cortisol levels are off. Like these different things are happening. Digestion is its own thing. Skin is part of it. You're getting eczema, all these things, right? So if you're somebody who you're sitting there and you're like, well, my symptoms are joint pain over here and eczema over here. And oh, my hair's falling out over here. And oh, by the way, like I'm having digestive and all this stuff, that is like the classic, you need to be looking at environment. You need to be looking at something beyond your basic blood panels that your traditional medicine doctor is looking at to try to understand what the root is that's causing this chaos in your body. Because what a lot of doctors do is they'll start treating the symptoms of all the things. Oh, for your hair, take this, your hair will grow back. And for your skin, here's a cream, here's a skin for your cream. And take this pill, that'll help with your joint pain. And that isn't fixing why it's all happening. And that's the difference between what functional medicine is versus traditional medicine. Traditional medicine is like prescribing the symptom. They're trying to reduce symptom. Functional medicine is trying to find root cause. And if you fix root cause, then the symptoms go away. And it's trying to get your body to be able to kind of come back and do what it's supposed to do naturally, as opposed to just prescribing pills and different things that are going to fight down symptoms. So that's the big difference. So if you're somebody or your kids or whatever, or you're in your house and you're noticing multi-symptom, right? So your kid is having neurological stuff, you're having gut stuff, your husband's having skin stuff, like you start seeing all that, you're like, we're all having all kinds of weird things, different areas of our body, different symptoms. That also is a trigger. So someone who is just trying to figure out, like, is this something I should be concerned of? Like, try to take that inventory.
Uh-huh.
And if any of that lines up, start looking for a functional medicine doctor wherever you live.
No, that's great advice, Brian. For those that are, they find themselves in this position where they're renting, right? They don't know where to go. What do you suggest? Do you suggest they go to their landlord first to discuss with them their symptoms or whatever they can find? Or do you what do you suggest for that? I mean, because I know it's kind of a weird situation when you have a landlord and stuff like that.
Yeah. So I've gone through this process like 3 or 4 times. I've gotten myself out of leases because some sort of water event happened. And I was like, oh, now I have a mold problem. So now I have to figure out how to get out of this thing. And going to them first isn't really the move, at least in my experience.
Okay.
What you need to go to them with is all of the evidence already.
Yes.
You need to come in with where you have set the narrative and it's their job to prove you wrong, as opposed to you coming in saying, like what happened to me in the very first place, I think I have a mold problem. They send someone out. Now the narrative is now they're in control and they say everything's fine. And then I had to have someone come back in and say, no, everything's not fine. And now like that power shift is there, right? And it's not to say they're not going to fight you back, but it's kind of like the first to market wins, right? Like that concept, right? So now it's difficult because we just talked about how local inspectors all kind of do this stuff the same way, right? So like, how do you go about doing this? So I made a training program for this, a lot for this reason, actually, which originated from how I trained my team. So, I created an internal program. Here's how we train my team to go through a house. And there's just specific, here's what to look for. Here's where to look for it. Here's all these different things. So then I went and I took that, I turned it into a training program. It's called Mold Finders Method. So you can go to moldfindersmethod.com. You can get the program there if you're so inclined. But what it does is it teaches you how to find the things in your house yourself, right? So it's actually not that hard to do. It's actually pretty easy to do. You just have to know what to look for and where to look for it. So think of this program as like paint by numbers for how to find mold in any room in your house. Basically what it is. It shows you what to look for, it tells you exactly where to look for it. And if it looks like that, then you mark it off, say this is a potential problem. And you just literally work through like that, right? And so what you can do with that is you can go through your entire space and you start identifying the areas, the sink cabinet over here and by the shower over here, these things that we talked about. Here's all these areas of suspicion that I have now. I found 8 things. Who knew, right? I mean, I've had people like internationally use this program. I had somebody in Japan find 34 problems in their house off of this program. Like this program was built for American homes because I live in America. Like I went through and I did it like that. And this person took it in Japan and it worked for them over there. Right.
Wow.
And so, so what you do is you can go through like that. And then what you can do, unfortunately, as the renter, depends on the relationship with your landlord, right? Like everybody has a different relationship. My landlord here at my house, we have such a good relationship. Like if I was concerned about something, I could go to them a little sooner in the process. Like I don't have to incur the cost potentially because of just, we have a good relationship. I know most landlords aren't like that, right? So in most scenarios, what you then kind of need to do is you need to come to the table with proof. If you just come with visuals, they'll be like, yeah, there's no mold there. There's nothing visible there. There's no mold there. It's just a stain. It's just a this or that or whatever. You're crazy, right? So you actually have to come with the labs that prove it, right? And so when you think of it, it's almost like you're building a court case for yourself to go and then present and to kind of have all of it lined up. So you need to show that there's a source in the house or multiple sources. You need to validate that through testing and you need to show the labs that shows it. And then you need to show that you're breathing it, which is where the dust testing comes in. So ideally what you do is you go through the program, you mark down the different things, and then you don't have to test everything. Pick 1 or 2 things, that like look the worst or you feel most confidence could be an issue. You can then call a local inspector to come in. And I even say this in the program because I talk about how you get your tests that you need. You tell them like, hey, I want you to come to my place. I don't want you to inspect anything. All I need to know is can you take these samples? Can you do a cavity sample? How do you do it? Perfect. I need you to do this. I don't want your protocol. I don't want anything. I literally just want you to come out here and be a robot that takes my samples for me and gives me everything else, and I'm fine, right? And then you take all of that, because now you're getting tested in the right way, but you're having a quote professional do the testing, right? So you have the validity behind who's doing the testing for you.
Yeah.
And then you come in and you're like, look, there's mold here. This is this is that. And then you can start to leverage some stuff. And when a landlord sees that you've built the paper trail basically on that, now they're thinking lawsuit, even though they're not saying it yet. And so they're going to be a little more amenable in that way to try to do something and try to fix it. And if not, just make sure you're always documenting everything. And at the end of the day, you have leverage now at this point. And, if landlords don't want to do the work, just because you're in a lease, is the thing that I learned in my first situation. Because I had just signed the lease like 4 months prior. And so my father-in-law is like, well, what do you want to do? I was like, what do you mean, what do I want to do? He's like, well, do you want to stay here or do you want to leave? It's like, well, I can't leave. I just signed this lease 4 months ago. He's like, of course you can leave. If they tell you you can leave, then you can leave. Like, contracts are only as good as the people who are enforcing them, right? If they change their mind, then who cares, right? And so if you make their life difficult, they're going to let you out of it because they know there's somebody else that will come in and do it just fine. So it also gives you the leverage that you need too, if you have to get to that point where you can start kind of pushing a little harder and get yourself out. So that's the quick overview of how I navigated these things.
Yeah, no, that was great information, because I think a lot of times people get stuck, right? They know there's a problem. They just don't know how to tackle the problem. And I thank you for your insight, Brian, for sure, because that cleared up a lot of, questions, I'm sure, of how to get out of a lease. You're not stuck. You're never stuck, right? There's always ways out of these things, Man, just great information, Brian. Truly, truly, man. What is a bit of advice you can share right now before we end this segment? One thing that you can leave with our audience, if you don't mind, brother.
It's possible. And I see people heal from this all the time. And I've seen people who had multiple inspections and all this stuff, and they think it's hopeless, and they think they have to burn their house down. They think they have to go live in the woods because there's no mold out there. And the reality is they just didn't have a good inspection, and they just didn't find the problems, or they just didn't remediate properly, right? So it's just about surrounding yourself with the right people. And a lot of times it's not easy, right? So hopefully, this helps with that. But I mean, I've seen a kid who went from playing like peewee football to being debilitated into a wheelchair on a feeding tube within like 6 months, to then solving the mold problem in the house that triggered all of that, and being back to playing Little League and all that stuff 9 months later.
Wow.
That was the swing on like a 10-year-old kid. So granted, not everyone's in that position. Yeah. But that's how it works. It can work. It does work. Sometimes it takes longer, obviously. Most times it takes longer, but like it can work. And so the hopelessness feeling that a lot of people get with this is kind of the biggest thing that I want to make sure that we can address, because it's not hopeless. We see it happen all the time. And hopefully, we can help guide you on how to do that.
Well, once again, thank you, Brian, from Mold Finders. I appreciate you. We're going to have all your links on the show notes, so that way people can get a hold of you and your program and everything like that. So once again, man, thank you. Thank you for coming on here and just sharing what you do, brother. Appreciate it.
Absolutely appreciate it. Thank you.